All right, everybody. This is an adequate or appropriate talk and presentation for right now and what we're dealing with. Extremely dry across the state. The projection for that, I'll bring up some outlooks, but essentially we're looking, if the skies don't open up here soon, we're looking to another year of drought. So drought management is a relevant topic for right now and going into the monsoon season. So to introduce myself, I am Casey Spackman. I am the Extension Range Management Specialist for New Mexico State University. If you tuned in a couple weeks ago, I gave a presentation on range monitoring. This ties a little bit into that. And so that's one of my focuses. Also, a focus is plant identification. And then also I work for a group called the Range Improvement Task Force here at the university, and we get involved with research as well as mitigating issues between livestock producers and other agency personnel. So basically stakeholder involvement on rangelands. So asking they say there's no dumb questions, right? So I can ask this. How do you know you're in a drought? Really, what are some things that make you think you're in a drought? We hear about fires right now. Is because we're having fires, is that an indication of drought? Just think about that. What makes you think that you're in a drought? So there's a couple of things. You have to have some sort of way to quantify drought, right? We have the U.S. Drought Monitoring Index that combines a bunch of technical things, precipitation being one. They use a lot of satellite imagery to assess greenness of vegetation across the nation. There's a whole bunch of things that go into this equation and program to produce these maps. So precipitation and vegetation is one of them. What I want to say is we have to have some sort of indicator to dictate whether we're above normal, or below normal. There's got to be some sort of baseline to assess that. And so we have to do some sort of quantification or quantification or qualification of the information we're seeing to get those baselines. So first one, I pulled this off. It's a little outdated, but it hasn't changed much. So you look at April 5th, so the beginning of the month, and what's going on in New Mexico. The majority of the state, almost 35% of the state were in somewhere between extreme to exceptional drought, and then the other 50% is in a severe drought, and then we have some of us that are moderate drought to abnormally dry. But in reality, the majority of the state is on that upper level of drought, and they've quantified it here. As far as the whole United States, you can see that the West is still in drought, the same drought that they were facing for the past 2 years. So this began in 2020. We kind of had a little bump last year with some monsoonal rains that kind of set it back just a little bit, but it wasn't enough to recover it. And that's why we're looking to this monsoonal season we're headed towards a drought if we don't get some rains. It's been an abnormally dry winter for the state. And then you can see from 2000, all those spikes that you can see in that red hue is when we were in an extreme or exceptional drought, which is quite a few spikes over the past 20 years. How about this one? To measure drought, vegetation indicators. Would you say you're in a drought if you've got a field like this? Well, this picture is kind of biased. There was a reason I took this picture. It has nothing to do with drought. It's soil composition. It's unable to grow the majority of vegetation in New Mexico. This is taken up on this is actually up on Laguna Pueblo. How about this one to assess drought? How many have you look at your animals for drought as an indicator? What is their performance? Are they dropping body weight? Are they trying to eat brush? Things like that. And we'll go over each and every one of these here in a minute. So skipping around a little bit instead of going in order, we already talked about climatic data and how they come across that as an indicator, and that's great. They're already keeping track of that for us. We do need more weather stations in the state, and they're working on that right now as well through the legislation that went through. We've got funding, and they're currently putting out a bunch of weather stations to help bolster that drought index. But let's look at your forages. So I've got two forages here, side oats grama and your threons. And there's a reason I chose these two particular. I would love to have I actually should have put black grama up here because it is the most desired grass to keep on rangelands for nutrition. But they're a complete contrast in their indication. We talked about indicators, right? So forage is an indicator of what the condition of your rangeland is. So if you got an abundance of threons, you might be at risk a little bit for overgrazing, decreasing, however you look at it, decreased conditions on rangelands. However, side oat grama is not that way. It actually is an indicator of good rangeland conditions. So the essentials of plants. This is going back to plant physiology 101, right? You need sunlight, water and minerals and nutrients. You combine all those, the plant's able to grow, take in carbon dioxide, and have an output of oxygen and sugars. So in drought, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the shoots provide the necessary things to bolster the health of the roots and storage of carbohydrates, whereas the root carbohydrates take in the nutrients and help the plant grow. So there's this trade-off between the two. And again, I'll go into that a little bit more here in a minute. This is what I wanted to get to with drought. So how essential is water? Well, all living biological entities, whether that be people, livestock, your plants, bugs, insects, everything needs water. It's an essential resource. So when we're in drought, we cut off that resource, and what does it do? All of a sudden, you have no way to take the minerals and nutrients out of the soil to help with plant growth. All of a sudden, you have this increased in UV radiation, which is going to start decreasing and basically withering your plant because the water not only takes up minerals, but it also is a source just like us to keep us cool. What do we do when we get hot? We either find shade, which plants can't do unless they're growing in a specific area where they get partial shade during the day, or they hydrate. And when water's lacking, they can't hydrate and they start withering. We would do the exact same thing. So it's a chain reaction. No water, no minerals. Without minerals, you have no growth. And without growth, you don't produce any plant biomass or what we would call sugars for your livestock. So let's talk about that. What happens when the water's cut off with your plants? So drought. So during drought and extreme drought, I'm talking about extreme droughts here. So when I say extreme droughts, that's not just 1 year of no water. That's persistent lack of water. Your forage production would decline about 7-fold. So a plant that's normally 10 inches tall during drought is only going to be 3 inches. Or a plant that weighs, or if you have on your range lands, you have 100 pounds per acre. During drought, you're likely to get about 30 pounds per acre. So there's a great reduction in the amount of forage available on rangelands during drought. In addition to that, not all plants are created equal, and not all plants are hardy enough to resist or persist, I should say, not resist, persist during stressful situations. And so you can get a really high mortality rate in extreme drought, up to 50% loss. And that's just with drought. You add grazing on top of that, and it's in a compounding effect. So when we have drought, when we graze, we've got to be careful to keep it at a certain level. As soon as we start doing high to severe grazing during drought, well, that's a long recovery period for 1 year. That's 5+ years of recovery, if you recover at all. However, if you do something low to moderate, you adjust your stocking rates, you adjust your distribution. For every year of drought, you'll need about 2 years of recovery to go back to a normal precipitation year. So diving into this one, what helps plants persist during drought? What is the difference between the 50% that die off and the 50% that don't die off? Well, it comes down to dealing with that stress. If a plant has adequate root reserves to persist during stress, they'll be fine because they're able to recuperate after that stress occurs. That stress could be anything. It's called disturbance, right? Disturbance is a stress. That could be fire, that could be grazing, that could be drought. It doesn't matter the stress that it's put through. It's the degree of stress that occurs. So as long as we keep a good amount of root reserves below the soil, we're generally going to be okay, even if we get into a drought. But that comes down to this. If you're trying to build up root reserves to persist during a stress, when do you graze? When's the proper time to go ahead and reduce the above ground mass of those plants? And this diagram is taken from the USDA, but it is for cool season grasses. So it applies up in the northern end of New Mexico, but when we get down south, there are it's a different growing season, different circumstances, and different root reserves. But the concept is still there. You want to try and graze when the seeds have ripened, or when the flower stalks are first evident. So essentially, you want to do it before all of that energy out of the roots goes up into production of seed heads. But you still want to, for perennial grasses, it's all right to graze them like that. But you still, if you're looking to have propagation of those seeds across the land, you still want to let some of those plants go to seed. So it's a careful balance there on use of the plants and also sustaining the carbohydrate reserve or the root reserves for the future to be able to persist through drought. So I talked about that a little bit. What are your current root nutrient reserves? Well, it's generally correlated that above ground mass in grasses equals below ground mass. The more mass you have below ground, the more carbohydrate reserve you've got, and the better off you're going to be when the drought ends and persists through that stress. However, persistent stress, so let's say you get 5 years of drought. Well, 5 years, that's like 5 years of persistent grazing. You're going to slowly reduce the amount of root mass and also your amount of nutrient reserves in those roots, and therefore you're not going to have a hardy of a plant or a persistent enough of a plant to subsist through those stressors such as drought. Now this is where things get complicated because everybody wants to make a dollar off their livestock. That's the end goal. That's why we're in ranching. That's why we're in livestock management. So as soon as we have drought come along, it's a compounding factor. If we use light to moderate grazing, it doesn't really hurt the root reserves, and that's been shown in science. If we do heavy to severe, it severely depletes those, and over time you can damage the plant. 1 year of heavy to severe grazing is not going to hurt the plants. It's like having 1 year of drought, but persistence of heavy grazing will. So here you go. How severe is the drought? So these are all questions you should be asking about your plants and drought. Just backing up a little bit. So a single year of drought, same thing as light to moderate grazing, doesn't really hurt it, but a persistent drought will eventually deplete those root reserves and have a higher likelihood of those plants dying off. So here's what I was talking about, what we call a compounding effect. So if we're grazing light to medium and we have a moderate drought for a year, yes, it's going to take those root reserves down, but they'll likely come back. However, if we're grazing heavy, we're trying to feed our way out of the drought, right? We're hitting our rangelands hard, trying to keep our cattle, trying to keep the genetics there. There's a lot of things that influence that. If we're trying to graze out of a drought, well, you're damaging the plants. You're depleting those root reserves because of the drought. So you have this compounding thing. So going further, so that's enough on the vegetation side. What about your animals? Have you ever thought about looking at your animals to assess how severe the drought is and what your management outlook looks like with drought? So body condition scores, going out and walking through your animals and ranking them and keeping a record for that. The university has a great publication on that, and that's where this table comes from. I didn't have room to put them all up here, but it gives you an idea of ranking your livestock, specifically cattle. I'm focusing on cattle, but there's other things. You can actually rank sheep and goats as well for your drought assessment. But body condition scores can indicate what's going on as far as your rangeland conditions during drought. So a great publication out there to help with that. And that is something that I know about, but it is not my field of expertise. So I will leave that publication for you to go and look at and introduce yourself to body condition scores, and also to better help you assess droughty conditions. So, body condition score, drought, well, it decreases your forage nutrition, the main thing that those animals are going for. So that's what happens is your body's condition score is going to start dropping because there's not the nutrition there to meet their demands. It's like eating popcorn all day versus going out and getting a nice steak to eat, right? It's not going to provide the nutrition you need, and you're going to start losing weight, and you're never really going to quite feel full. Also, we talked about this with your vegetation, the abundance isn't there. So that's an interesting thing, because if your abundance isn't there, well, they're going to seek out something to eat. And so they often go to other plants that may not necessarily be that good for them. So overall, because of these things, you get reduced cattle gains, reduced body condition scores, and they start searching out some of those plants that are not normally consumed. And so you get poisoning cases. And that's what this next slide is. You can see the roots. That's all that's left of your good grasses, and you're left with these others. Well, they've got to feed on something, and so you've got to watch close, because some of these plants are toxic. So they'll actually go to brush species. Cattle are primarily grazers, but you push them to a point, they're going to get hungry, and they'll start eating shrubs and bushes that are actually detrimental to them. Same with sheep. Goats really don't have a problem with goats. There are some species that they will go after that'll be toxic, but goats are pretty hardy when it comes to poisonous plants. Here's something that I didn't address in those slides. Have you ever thought about your water sources and what's happening to your water sources during drought? You know, obviously, without water, the quantity of water available for your livestock is going to go down. But hey, mineral accumulation. Have you thought about that? You know, we have these places that have salt deposits on the top of the soil. How did that get there? Well, the water runs into basins and accumulates, and then upon evaporation, that's where those salts start settling, and you get an accumulation of those minerals, and those minerals in turn can be toxic to livestock. Even when you're pumping things like groundwater through a well system like this, you can still, during drought, accumulate toxic amounts of minerals, because you just don't have well, for one, you have more heat, not enough cloud cover and water, and so your tanks they start evaporating. You're having to constantly fill them, and even though you're filling them with good fresh water, because of the evaporation cycle during drought, you start to accumulate those minerals in the bottom, and eventually you basically have a toxic mineral amount in your watering takes. How about locality and distance livestock travel? You know, when we've got monsoonal rains, it kind of cools things down, but with drought, man, the temperatures skyrocket. And what are those livestock doing? Just like those plants, if you cut off the water, they'll tip over. You'll turn cows upside down. The sheep will start dying on you. And so locality to water is important, not just for the animal, but also for your vegetation. So in a drought management, when dealing with drought, you want to make sure that your distance from water is as short as can be, because in the literature it shows that about a mile from water, they'll use about 100% of the vegetation. 1 to 2, it goes down to about 50%, and anything over 2 to 3 miles, you really don't utilize any of that. So that's key. So if you're trying to keep forage on the ground, where your watering sources are will help you persist through a drought. So it's that distribution of livestock and keeping them healthy in the hot temperatures of drought, and also protecting your forage sources. With drought, I talk about temperature a lot. Temperature is key with drought. It always goes up. So bacteria, algae, all those things, you're going to get blooms in your watering sources. It can be an issue for livestock. And so keep an eye on that during drought, and make sure you're assessing those things. So let's change gears a little bit. How often does drought occur in New Mexico? It's a good question, right? You look at this graph. So the literature, it states that it's about 60% of the time in New Mexico. So this is over 22 years. And out of those 22 years, we've got 12 years that are in moderate to, well, not moderate, extreme to exceptional drought. Meaning that in 20 years, we'll have 12 droughts. That's pretty close to that 60% mark that we're going to be under the normal precipitation and temperature, below the normal precipitation averages, and above in your temperature averages. So what do we do about it? What do we do about drought? What are management approaches that we can take? Well, the only way that we can tell that we are above or below normal is measurable indicators. And the only way to get measurable indicators is planning and monitoring. No, I'm not going into monitoring. I believe that the last presentation I gave is up and on the YouTube channel, and so you can go back and look at that. But monitoring is key to establish vegetation trends, so you can plan. So you can see that 12 out of the last 22 years were in drought. Well, you're going to see trends in the vegetation, and you can assess and have red flags that pop up when you start seeing certain things happening on your rangelands concerning vegetation. So it's very important that we monitor the vegetation, establish trends. Grazing records is another way we can keep track of that. What's our stalking rates? When were our turnout and turn in dates? What was their distribution? All of those things are key to your grazing records. Keeping track of your livestock and what they're doing, where they're grazing, how their body condition scores have been over the years. Are your body condition scores high when you've got good precipitation? Where are they at when you got drought? Talked about water assessments, right? Your livestock records, kind of a duplicate of grazing records, but a little bit different. Weather records. You can look at the drought database. There's plenty of places. The university has a climate website that you can look at some of the COCRA weather stations. Those are public. people that have volunteered to keep track of the weather for around the state. There's many other weather station types for the state that we can look at and predict weather changes, and more are coming. More will come in the next couple of years because of the money we receive from the legislative session. Soil characteristics. Do they hold water? Does their temperature stay cooler during hot times? Do we have abundant organic matter that those plants can readily take up during a time of drought? Are they more efficient when we get a little precipitation to take up those nutrients because we have a good organic matter layer in the soils? Do we have good stability in the soils so that when we do hit drought, our topsoil doesn't blow away? For every inch of soil lost due to wind erosion or other types of erosion, it takes well over 100 years to restore that 1 inch of soil. And usually that is hard to do because, I mean, if we're getting 60% of the time in drought, we're not going to get 100% or 100-year recovery on that inch of soil. It'll be compounding to where we get an eighth of an inch back and then another inch blows away. So it's very important that we protect those soils from erosion. So just some of these measurable indicators, right? I will go into the monitoring stuff of vegetation. I have to put my 2 cents in there because that's one of the main things I focus on. When I was talking in the last webinar, I listed out some key things. If there's nothing else you can take for monitoring, take certain things. Well, guess what? Photo points during drought don't do you much good. They don't really assess an immediate reaction for you. Neither does cover or species composition. Those things are all just extra. However, biomass, so you clip and weigh those samples and measure stubble heights to see how they're doing. That is going to give you an indicator of how you're doing during drought. So you have regular monitoring, and then you have extreme circumstances like drought, where you change up your monitoring protocols a little bit. And biomass is the number one thing you want to take during drought. So what is biomass? Well, you put a square out there of a known size, clip it, dry it, weigh it in grams, record it so you can keep track of it, and then there's a conversion factor. You can estimate pounds per acre. Pounds per acre is very important during drought because you'll need to adjust your stocking rates accordingly. We can't just keep on going like we normally do during a drought. We're going to have to reduce stocking rates, or we're going to have to improve our distribution across the landscape. We may have to adjust our timing to turn out into certain pastures. So that's why I say biomass is very important during drought. It'll give you a better indicator of what's going on, and it'll save your rangelands. Going back to this, I already talked about this. Above ground generally equals below ground and your potential stocking rate. So because you're taking biomass samples, you get pounds per acre. And that also translates into what I was talking about before of your overall root reserves and how they're going to deal with the stress of drought. So considerations for drought management, or drought planning in particular. Have a drought management plan. If 60% of the time is in drought, that should be a priority for you to say, okay, we don't know when the drought's coming, but if we happen to be in a drought, let's have a plan for that. Let's be able to adapt quickly and Your rangelands will benefit. Your pocketbook will benefit. Everything in the long run will benefit if you have a management plan. Number 2, never ever try to feed out of a drought. When I say feed out of a drought, never try to just keep grazing the rangelands as if they have an unlimited resource. It'll lead to overgrazing, your forage, you'll deplete those root reserves, your range will become deteriorated, you'll start getting more erosion because you don't have plants on the ground, you won't have plants for the future, and so you're dinging yourself because it's not sustainable. You're not going to have a forage for the future. So if you get ahead of it with your ranch management plan, you're preserving those plants so you can actually make more money in the long run, even dealing with drought. That's why I put bankrupt ranch. That's the best way to bankrupt a ranch is try to feed out of a drought. Number 3, do you need to adjust stocking rates? So when I say adjust stocking rates, there's specific things in there for stocking rates. It just doesn't mean necessarily the numbers, but think about, for instance, I put it in here, you've got a cow-calf herd, right? Well, if you're running 100% of a cow-calf, consider running some stockers. Maybe cut your cow-calf groups down to 50 or 60% and run the other 40, 50% as stockers. Well, when you run into drought, you can sell off those stockers, right? And then all of a sudden, you still got that income from your cow-calf herd. Whereas if you are running 100% cow-calf, you have a hard time recovering because you're getting rid of your genetics. Number 4, forage alternatives. Do you have a reserve pasture? They call them drought reserve pastures. I hate the term that they use in a sacrifice pasture. That's not what I'm talking about here. A sacrifice area or pasture is something where during drought, you just graze the heck out of it and then hope it returns, but you're saving the rest of your land. That can be a strategy, but it's not a good strategy because once you deplete that sacrifice area, well, what if the drought persists for future years? What's your next sacrifice area? It's this slippery slope. So a better way to do this is always have one pasture on reserve. Always have one pasture resting, or something that you can go to in case there is a drought, and you're running out of feed. Most people are sensitive about talking about this, but have a destocking plan, have a sell plan. So identify times when it's good. Look at the trends in the markets and determine, all right, what's a good time to sell? If I sell now, are the markets going to go up down the road and I can get a better price, or are they going to slump off? Know your market. Also, know your stages of your grass growth. So this comes back to monitoring. I'll emphasize monitoring again of your vegetation. Know the cycle of your grasses. Are they going to produce, or are they on the tail end where they've already produced in this drought? What are they doing? Need to identify these critical times so that you can put that into your management plan so you can respond accordingly and timely. A big topic that's been coming up, I believe our extension agent emphasizes this a lot during drought, Craig Gifford. can I wean early? So it's if you can, you can save as much as 33% of your forage and water consumption. So that's pretty significant. If you're weaning a month earlier, even 2 weeks earlier, guess what? That may be an extra week to get you by without having to buy extra supplements for your animals. Or if you're running out of water, it's an extra week. Hopefully you'll get water in a week or two, and you can persist through the drought and not have to sell off. And then I think I've emphasized this one enough and talked about it quite a bit. Can you improve grazing distribution? So it's one of those things that just buys time. It minimizes overgrazing. Keep in mind, I talked about water sources. Where are your water sources? Can you throw some salt out there and get your livestock into areas that they don't normally graze like they should? So getting the cattle distributed. So monitoring those cattle, monitoring your vegetation and where they go. Last topic that I want to cover, green fever. We all love green grass, especially after a drought. Don't give into it. Don't be tempted to increase your herd number just because everything's greening up. As I pointed out earlier, when you're a drought, 2 years of recovery. So those plants are stressed. And so if you go in and start hitting them heavy, even though that they're green, they're still recovering. They're still trying to reestablish themselves and bolster those roots. And so give them a little bit of time. Just keep your stocking rates where they are at. Because another thing, we don't know if this is just one of those years where we get a bumper amount of rain, and the next year we're going to be back in the drought. So if you increase your stocking rate, and then all of a sudden the next year we're right back in it, well, you're going to have to stress about selling all those animals, and you may lose your dollar because everybody else is trying to sell at the same time too. So
I have a question. This is Marge.
Hey Marge, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm at the ranch, park on top of the hill. You mentioned 1 year equals 1 year drought equals 2 year for regrowth. So
hold on just a minute. Let me clarify that.
Okay.
I'm not talking about regrowth, because they will regrow within that first year. What I'm talking about is recovery and resilience.
Okay, recovery. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I should you changed the slide. I didn't catch that. But
Here, I'll go back.
Recovery. Yes, recovery. So in our area, we're probably like in a 2 year drought here. Well, actually 3 years. And so and then I just thought, wow, does that mean that 3 year we'll have like a 6 year of grass recovery? And I think we really seriously need to think about this as a producer. But like you had mentioned in early one of those slides, that we have to plan. We have to start reducing our cattle. So I think that's some of us are doing that. And but well, I don't want to say anything, but I think that's a good point. You're bringing up a good point here. And yeah, I just like all the presentation you're providing us. Thank you. I like that green fever too.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we're talking about recovery. It doesn't necessarily, so 3 years of drought, right? Yes, ideally to get right back where we were before the drought. it would be ideal to wait 6 years. You'll have a bumper of a grass crop if we wait 6 years. When we talk about recovery, be very cautious with that. You can still graze the plants. What we're talking about is getting those root systems back to a really healthy a system, and getting that organic matter in the soil up. You can still graze them, but be very cautious. I would, this green fever, don't go and bump your stocking rates up.
Mm-hmm.
Persist with what you've been doing in the drought for the next green year, and you shouldn't hurt. And it just, they'll slowly and gradually start recovering if you graze that light to moderate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep. All right, guys, some resources. I'm gonna wrap it up. Some resources for you. Most of the stuff that I'm taking from my slides is from a guide that was published by the university, Managing Rangelands and Cattle in Drought-Prone Areas of the Southwest. It is readily available online. You can look that up. It's been reviewed by Nick Ashcroft. It's due for another review, and I'm looking into that. Some other resources for you: supplementation programs. That's key to grazing management. So you can look into that, and then New Mexico range plants. If you're questioning what's a good indicator of rangeland conditions, what's an indicator of decreased rangeland conditions, the New Mexico range plants goes into that kind of stuff, as well as identification, and then helping you develop a grazing system in the Southwest. So all of these are good tools. They're all online. Of course, if you have any questions, my contact details are there on the slide. You can send me an email or just give me a call, and I can help answer some of your questions as well. So, but that's all I have for you. If you've got more questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks, Marge, for that good question. Thanks, Casey, for explaining that thoroughly. But like what Casey have mentioned, if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can go ahead and insert your question in the chat box. Well, I'll go ahead and ask you a question, Casey.
Yes.
So you talked about mineral accumulation, and I wanted to know, like, is there a way, like, it can be done to prevent like a very high toxic amount of mineral accumulation in like windmills, tanks and stuff? Like, is that possible, or is that not something that can be?
It is possible. So with your well tanks, your open tanks from groundwater pumps, you're looking at evaporation as being your biggest contributor to mineral accumulations in those. I know they've been pushing shade balls for things like that. Other things they use is canopies over the top of waterers, just to prevent extreme radiation of those. It prevents evaporation. So evaporation is going to be your biggest enemy when it comes to those well water tanks.
Okay.
But one of the biggest things is your dirt tanks. So when we do have water sitting there, dirt tanks are primarily from, well, they're not primarily, they are from runoff. So anytime we get runoff with water, it accumulates off the hill. It's washing those soils essentially. And so depending on what your soils are, you're going to accumulate certain minerals and elements into those dirt tanks. And then because the water's trapped there, every year when those dirt tanks dry out, unless it's a pretty perennial or pretty significant dirt tank, you're going to start accumulating those toxic chemicals over time. So the best thing to do with that is, well, there's no best answer to that. Sometimes we need to break the dam, let Mother Nature do its course, or you've got to use a mechanical means of going in and stripping the topsoil off those dirt tanks to prevent mineral accumulation. So just a couple ideas to think about when we're talking about mineral accumulation in water tanks.
Okay. Thanks, Casey. You also have a question in the chat box. It's on Lee White here. Does forage grow in the winter time? If you want to unmute yourself, feel free.
All right, so in the winter time, that's a good question. It depends on where you're at, right? It depends on where you're at, and it depends on what species you're talking about. Temperature is key. So no, we don't get any winter growth. There are some species that mostly annuals that will grow during the winter time. The growth is limited, but in general, no, we don't really get any forage growth in the winter. But there are certain circumstances where we do get it, and most of those are annual grasses. So hopefully that answered your question, Lee.
Casey, I have another. Well, actually, I don't have a question, but I have a request. I don't know where I can request this, but on the Navajo Nation, there's a lot of rangeland, and the carrying capacity were identified like maybe 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But today it's a different environment. And I think you mentioned in your slide that we can clip, we can dry, and we can weigh. I think that's easy for me to do. But as far as calculating it, the calculation portion, I'll be lost in that. I really want to try that. I really want to try that to the pasture that we are using. I would like to clip, dry, and weigh the forage, the stuff that I clip, but I need to know how to calculate it, because I like to know what the carrying capacity is for this 5,000 acres that we are utilizing at this point in time. So I think most of us, we're struggling with the carrying capacity that was figured into the grazing permit or the lease agreement. It's very high, and the ranchers are paid at that rate that was identified back in 30 years ago, while some ranchers are only running like maybe 25% of that capacity rate. So I really want to justify where I sit and where I'm at. And is there a way where you can help me?
That's a very relevant topic that I've been asked several times, and actually I wrote a paper on that. I can't distribute it yet because it's not in publication, but I've got your information down, Marjorie, and I will send you some of the information that I have on that to help you out, calculate carrying capacity and stocking rates, things like that.
Thank you. I would really want to implement it and use that justification to request an adjustment for our pasture area.
Perfect.
Thank you. Good job.
Daryl, did you have a question? I see you've got a raised hand there.
Yeah. Hi, Casey. This is Daryl. So I wanted to know if I could get a copy of that too. Same request, but also my question was more towards revegetating. If you think that would be one of the points that one would do, as far as like trying to reduce a lot of the overgrazing. And also, would you know what grass species are great that kind of tolerate drought, but also are able to hold a grazing capacity for however many or whatever livestock is grazing? For me myself, I have a lot of sheep. Well, I just have sheep for livestock.
Yep.
So I just wanted to know what's a good revegetation on I guess a good amount of area is good for that.
Yeah, so revegetation in the state of New Mexico, very, very hard without irrigation. It's the success is very, very limited unless you time those monsoon rains just right. And we get it over 2 years, because that's essentially what it takes for plants to become established. Because just because you get a good seeding success rate in the first year, if we get a drought the next, those plants are still weak and they will shrivel. So it's really hard. And I mean, when I say really hard, I'm talking only a 10 to 15% success rate when you're revegetating on rangelands in New Mexico. So your best bet is to take existing grasses that you've got and really bolster them to the extent possible and have them spread and have them reestablish themselves rather than trying to reseed. So what you can do to help that is you can wait for some of these plants to seed out, and you can hand collect seeds and just spread them in your day-to-day activities on the ranch, right? Just spread those seeds, and that's a natural process. And those particular seeds are adapted to the specific environment they're growing in, especially during droughty conditions. The plants that survive during droughty conditions are going through a process of adaptation. And so those are the ones that are going to persist in the drought. As far as what plants, there's predictions of what can grow there. That comes from the NRCS soil site and is based off of ecological site descriptions. It gives you a starting point. It is not 100% accurate on what can grow there. Like Marjorie was talking about, times have changed. The things that worked 30 years ago are not necessarily going to work in this day and age. Specific species that will thrive. Yes, there are species that thrive. However, are they palatable? Generally not. And so because of that, I'm not going to promote those, because they are there for an ecological point, reduce erosion, and just generally get something in place to help build up that soil profile. But they are pretty much useless for livestock. So I won't suggest any of those, but I think your best bet is to scatter the native seeds that are right there in your pasture, if you've still got some of those established. So
Okay, great.
I hope
No,
that
that's good.
answered your question.
I'm kind of doing some, I guess, test plots of if I grow it in kind of basically seed starting them and then transplanting.
Okay.
I don't know if you've heard of that, or if that's possible to do.
It is possible. I'm mostly dealing with rangelands of large pasture sizes. And when you start doing that kind of stuff, it is really time consuming. On a smaller scale, I don't know exactly what your pasture sizes are, but it can work. Yeah. And it's interesting because once you get those established and adapted, you can start propagating the seeds, and it's a self-reinforcing cycle to where you're getting more plants, more reproduction, more seeds, and it'll build on that. as long
Okay.
as we're not adding additional stress to them with overgrazing and extreme drought.
Gotcha. So, okay, next question. As far as the reseeding part, using the native seeds, what would be a good time frame prior to like an expected rainfall? Should we try to plant them? And then, yeah, so that's, I guess, my big question.
Yeah, so right, that's easy. So your success will depend on the water that you put to them. General principle of rangelands. You get the right precipitation at the right time, you're going to get them established. So you're either going to seed them right before the monsoonal rains start, or in the fall before the fall freeze, or when the soil temperatures fall, because those seeds will actually go dormant because of the cold temperatures, and then they're right there available with any spring moisture. So yeah, so you're looking at what, June, or throw them down sometime in September.
Okay. Alrighty. Cool. Thanks.
All right, well, that will conclude our Q&A session right there. So thank you so much, Casey, for taking some time out of your busy schedule to do this drought management webinar. A lot of things to take back with us. And if you guys are interested in his grazing management webinar, which he did a couple weeks ago, that is on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go ahead on over to YouTube and just type in our project name, it's the Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project, and just search for grazing management in Casey's name, and it will be there for you. So this will also be, it is recorded, so it is going to be on our YouTube page as well. So thank you, Casey. A lot of great tips from this session, and a lot of great tips that you have provided during the grazing management. So really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so that will lead me to our ending announcements. I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to have our next webinar is going to be on the Dene Wool program, which will be presented by Benita Litson, who's the director of Dene College Land Grant Department. She's also partnering with Kedrell Russell. I believe that's her co-presenter. This will be on April 28th, starting from 5:30, ending to 6:30 p.m. The Zoom link is provided below, but just to let you guys know that we do have a Facebook page, and it will give you a reminder what's our upcoming events. And we also have a monthly newsletter. So we'll notify you guys next week, starting Monday, of our upcoming webinar. So be expecting an announcement coming from our NSA project. I also posted our NSA project website, so if you want to head on over to our website as well. We have a lot of information that is displayed on our website, from the Navajo Nation directory to the USDA office, local office directory as well. A lot of other important information are on there as well. So we also, like I said, have a YouTube channel. So if you want to head on over to view other webinars that you may have missed, feel free to do so. But that will conclude our presentation tonight. So the Navajo Sustainable Agriculture Project, in short, we call it NSA project, is a New Mexico Cooperative Extension Service initiative delivered in collaboration with two of our project partners. One of them is the Dene College Land Grant Office, and COPE, which stands for the Community Outreach and Patient Empowerment. Our project is funded by the USDA OASDVFR program. That's a mouthful, but what it stands for is the Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers program. To go ahead and go on to the next slide, our project is basically to help improve the operations and profitability and sustainability of our socially disadvantaged Navajo farmers and ranchers and better farmers and ranchers. We also encourage an increase of our producers' knowledge in the use of USDA programs, and this can include the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Services, Farm Service Agency, Rural Development, and Risk Management Agency programs and services, and those of other resource providers. We also encourage an increase of local production and consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables and promote healthy food and eating for our Native families and individuals. So that concluded our little short introduction to our NSA project. So